Do you know how many files your employees have uploaded, downloaded, emailed, airdropped, slacked, or shared via Google Drive today? A lot of that data has left your organization, and you don't even know it. Visit code42.com to learn how Insider prevents data exfiltration.
Is eating fish healthy? Certainly not for the fish, and most definitely not for the oceans. That's the reason the Sarno brothers, founding chefs at Good Catch Foods, began perfecting 100% plant-based seafood. They wanted sustainable options that are respectful of all creatures and don't harm our oceans. Ask your grocer for Good Catch Foods like tuna and crab cakes, or shop online at goodcatchfoods.com. Then, host your own Fishless Friday and feel good about every bite.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jeffrey Epstein Show. I'm your host, Bobbycapucci, and this is a morning update. We have been diving into the FinCEN files in regards to Jeffrey Epstein and our case as a whole. Well, today we're going to dive back in, and it looks like Congress is ready to move on some of these shell companies. Now, I've heard that time and time again when it comes to Congress. I've heard a lot of lip service from them throughout the years. I've followed Congress very closely for the last 2 decades. And if there has ever been a group of people who like to talk without backing it up with action, it most certainly is the United States Congress. So while I hope that they're ready to go after shell companies and get this money laundering under control, I'm in a show me state, right? I don't believe it until they do it. At this point, how can we believe anything that's coming out of Congress or the Senate or anywhere from any of the historical bastions of power? They have done nothing but lie to us over and over and over again, and I'm just talking about since 9/11. Never mind going back before then, but it's just been a constant screwing of the American people by both sides of the aisle. And I'm tired of it. So if they're just going to talk about going after these companies, if they're just going to give us lip service about going after these shell companies and ending money laundering, then they should just shut up and continue with their partisan nonsense. But if they're really ready to move into a phase that includes action and tangible penalties for people involved, then they most certainly will have my support. But again, we're dealing with some people that are almost as bad as these bankers, right? Maybe in some cases, obviously not even maybe, definitely in some cases worse than these bankers. So we're at a point where we're staring down into a pit of vipers and we're looking for one that's not so poisonous to help us out pretty much. So who knows? Maybe somebody in Congress is actually going to push this forward. Maybe somebody in Congress actually does care about this stuff. But to be honest with you, they've had all of these years to fix it. They wield extreme power. They're the ones who write the laws, and they have done nothing. Their inaction speaks volumes. Our article today is from BuzzFeed News, and it is part of our FinCEN files investigation. This will be part 4 of the FinCEN files in regards to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Headline: Congress is close to ending anonymous shell companies. This article was authored by Paul McLeod. After years of inaction, Congress is looking to pass substantial reforms of the financial system. The FinCEN files investigation spotlighted the pivotal role of shell companies in moving dirty money. Well, I said from the jump that these FinCEN files this is what journalism should be, folks. In my opinion, in my humble opinion, this is what journalism should be. Finding a story like this and digging in like a bulldog and chasing it down to wherever it may end. Journalists shouldn't be part of the resistance. Journalists shouldn't be party in power. Journalists should be pro-truth and getting to the bottom of things. Instead, we see 2 separate realities form because the media wants to carry water for one side or the other. And you know who gets screwed then, folks? Us. That's who gets screwed. And do you really think Congress would have been taking this action if the FinCEN files didn't drop, if the journalists, the brave investigative journalists who dug into this didn't shine a spotlight on it? Do you really think Congress would be taking action, or would they be sitting around playing grab ass still? I know what I think, and it's definitely the grab ass option. For over a decade, there have been calls in Congress to address shadowy corporate entities known as shell companies that are considered a cornerstone of fraud, corruption, and money laundering. For over a decade, huh? Just over a decade? Right there shows you the problem. These congressmen and congresswomen and these lawmakers, they have used these shell companies themselves. How do you become rich as a congressman on that salary? Can anybody answer that question for me? Well, I'll answer it for myself. It's because you have many fingers in many pies. These people become congressmen and senators and congresswomen because of the power. It's not because they want to help people. All right? It's not because they care about their constituents or their communities. The vast majority of these people only care about increasing their power. And unless the spotlight is turned on an issue like this, they'll ignore it because it benefits them and their friends. That's just the cold hard reality of it, folks. People don't want to believe it. People don't want to hear it. It's the truth. These companies help unsavory characters and organizations hide wealth or use the proceeds of crime to buy up legitimate assets ranging from a condo to an entire building on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. And the U.S. is one of the easiest jurisdictions in the world for setting them up. How often did we see Epstein involved in real estate? How much property did he have? How many assets did he have? What else was he involved in? How much of this stuff was facilitated by the shitty laws that Congress has on the books? All of it was. So again, I ask you, how long are you going to keep sending those incumbents back to D.C.? I know me, I'm voting them all out. That's where I'm at. I don't trust any of them. I don't care what letter you have next to your name. All you do is go to D.C. and play partisan politics, rile up people that would never be riled up before, and play a divisive game that is damaging the whole entire system. All because you people are power hungry. I am sick of it. I am done with it. And the only power that I have is to vote them out. So that's what I'm doing. On Election Day, I am not voting for one single incumbent. Startingly, these entities can require less disclosure than getting a library card. Imagine that, huh? Imagine how easy it is to be a thief in the United States of America or any other westernized country. If you got some bucks and you got some connections, well, you can be a modern day thief, steal from the people, not pay your taxes, and just, get on with it. Because guess what? They're so-called polite society, and we are literally nothing to them. That means all of them, folks, all of your favorites, all of these politicians you get down into hero worship for, they do not care about you. Understand that. Why don't you write them a letter if you can't pay your rent and see if any of them step up to help you? It's just like Sonny said to C in A Bronx Tale about Mickey Mantle. Is Mickey Mantle going to pay your rent? No, he's not. So kill the hero worship. Because it's bad news, folks. And they prey on your fear and on your anger. And they rely on us being divided. Now legislation that would force disclosure of who owns a company registered in the U.S. has once again advanced in Congress. Its fate is uncertain, but interested parties agree this is the strongest chance yet for reforms to pass. So now, I highly suggest that we all call our congresspeople and senators and everybody else and tell them that we want massive reform in the financial sector. How did these people get away without reforming shit after the meltdown in 2008, 2009? How did they get away with it? Oh, easily, because Congress let them get away with it. Nobody was held accountable. Ever. All of these hotshot financial jerk-offs, all of these scumbags that inhabit Wall Street, none of them paid the price. You know who paid the price? Me and you. Our retirement plans, our dreams, our hopes, our futures, all crushed under their $5,000 foot heel. And nobody went to jail. Well, now Congress has a chance to fix it. The question is, will they? Or will they continue to let people like Jeffrey Epstein skate the system, launder money, and use those laundered funds to facilitate their crimes? There is a stark choice here, folks, and Congress needs to do the right thing. The final push comes as BuzzFeed News and the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists in the FinCEN Files investigation have exposed the vast amounts of dirty money washing through the U.S. economy and how shell companies help foster that flow. And, you would think, right? You hear shell companies and you're thinking criminals. For me, before I really dove into this, I thought about shell companies. I figured, rich people, obviously, but I never knew the scope of what was going on in my own country, right? I was so focused on other things, the Near East, meaning the Middle East. That was where my whole entire focus was for the past 2 decades. That's all I really focused on. And then when I started to really zero in on what was going on in my own backyard, I was just blown away by how many shell companies are set up, how many politicians, current and former, are involved in this sort of shit, and just how pervasive financial crimes are in this country. It blew me away, folks. And it's time to stop it. It is time for it to end. We've discussed how bad and how harmful money laundering is on the poorest amongst us. And I'm sure that's a lot of our friends and family, right? Look, it's not easy to get ahead if you're not born ahead, right? It's possible in the United States. There's no doubt that if you work hard in the United States and you focus on you and you make good decisions, you can drag yourself up from nothing and become successful. I watched my own father do it. When I was a child, we first moved to Las Vegas. My grandmother was dying of lung cancer. We had nothing. My dad had just graduated from audio school. There was 15 of us in a 1-bedroom apartment. And I watched my pops get up every single day, 4:30 in the morning, and walk up to the Las Vegas Strip looking for a job. And then finally, he scored a good gig and worked his way up and became a pretty high-powered person in the entertainment field in Las Vegas. And I'm proud of him for that, right? But he did that himself with no help. So it's definitely possible. And there are stories of like that. I'm sure all of us have them in our family for the most part. But we can't let Congress get in the way of that kind of stuff. We can't let these laws stop people from achieving those sort of goals and let these sort of money laundering schemes and plots keep people in poverty. And we've seen how it works. We've seen what money laundering does. And we have seen the effects it has on the community as a whole. I don't think people think about it. Not enough of my colleagues do, said Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown. It's bigger all the time. There's more money swashing around all the time in all kinds of nefarious ways. Organized crime, elections, everything. There's no doubt about it. Look, Sherrod Brown is 100% right. There is so much money swishing and swashing and moving around that it is almost impossible to track it. Especially when you have the compliance divisions of these institutions in on it, like we've seen with some of the bigger situations with Jeffrey Epstein. So it is up to Congress to put their foot down. But how could Congress put their foot down if we have Congress populated by bipedal serpents like Ghislaine Maxwell? People who are writing laws so that they can avoid this kind of shit. It is a never-ending circle of madness. The wheel needs to be broken. Not just a spoke, but the whole entire wheel needs to be broken. Senate Banking Committee Chair Mike Crapo and Brown, the ranking member, co-authored legislation that would force limited liability companies every year to reveal their true beneficial ownership. The person who controls the company owns at least 25% of it or receives economic benefits from the company's assets. Such disclosures would make it harder to run these companies anonymously, removing one of the reasons these companies are employed for moving money around the globe. Look, we enough is enough. All right, with the anonymous ownership, and if you're driving an Uber, you have to go through all kinds of loopholes and get a TIN identification, all sorts of shit. You mean to tell me that if you're running one of these shell companies, nobody has to know anything about it? There's no checks and balances. Come on. You see, folks, how the game is rigged? And you see how it's not rigged in your favor? Those with power and wealth continue to build power and wealth, while you and I are left to scrape by, and we're forced and turned to hate each other. That is the game that they play. That is the game that they rely on. And that is how their system stays intact. By keeping us at each other's throats with their BS nonsense on a regular basis. Well, I'm not buying it. I'm not being gaslit by them. And if they think that I'm going to sit by and keep quiet, they are absolutely in for a big old shock. Ownership information would be shared with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, an agency within the Department of Treasury that combat money laundering, terrorist financing, and other financial crimes. Crapo's legislation would also require the Government Accountability Office to study the availability of true beneficial ownership information for other legal entities. Look, this is good stuff, right? If they can get this through, if Brown and Crapo can move this ball and get the other scuzzballs to sign on to it, I think it's a good start, right? I'm not a big fan of regulation for the most part, especially over-regulation. It's burdensome to business. But what these people have proven is that they can't be trusted. It's like having a child and you give them a little leeway and then they sneak out. Well, now we know you like to sneak out, so you're grounded. And that's how it is with these institutions. They were given great lateral ability to operate without any oversight, basically. And they screwed up. So now, oversight and repercussions. Companies with over 20 employees and at least $5 million in annual sales, as well as physical presence in the United States, would be exempt under the assumption they're legitimate businesses rather than shell companies. The legislation also would take steps to improve how banks communicate with FinCEN, require federal regulators to undergo training in detecting money laundering, and establish a new FinCEN whistleblower program. Back to the loopholes, huh? Companies with over 20 employees and at least $5 million in annual sales. They're exempt, though, because there's the assumption that they're legitimate. That's probably because they're fellow Congress people. Those are the kind of companies that they own, right? So they got to have that exemption slipped in there for them. So again, we're right back where we started. Crapo and Brown. This is just lip service, folks. This doesn't reach far enough. This does not reach far enough at all. Don't get me wrong, it's a good starting point. It's nice to see Congress taking a look. But at the end of the day, I'm tired of Congress, quote unquote, taking a look. How about some action? Linda Lacewell, superintendent of the New York Department of Financial Services, recently wrote in Law 360 that the reports filed to the federal government by banks about suspicious financial activity are frequently riddled with the names of anonymous shell companies that make it practically impossible to determine the identity of the perpetrator. It basically negates all of the safeguards. If you don't know who's in control of the company, how can you follow the money? How can you be sure that that money isn't being used to, say, fund a sex trafficking operation? You can't be sure. And that's part of it. They want that plausible deniability, right? So they wrote these laws so these people can stay anonymous. It is an absolute joke. In that essay, prompted by the FinCEN Files investigation, she also wrote, therefore, as a first step, we must all move to require disclosure of beneficial owners of corporations and limited liability companies in financial transactions. Yes, 100% I agree. There needs to be disclosure, and it needs to be complete. There can be no BSing around. This is not something to joke around with, folks. This is literally them stealing our future from us. and then using those funds to commit the most heinous crimes you could possibly imagine. Everything from genocide to sex trafficking. Banks, law enforcement, human rights groups, labor unions, and state attorneys generals are among the coalition supporting the legislation. Even the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is on board. But there is one influential force pushing back. Small business. Now, I am usually a champion of small business. Mom and pop stores, I shop there if I can. I spend as much money possible at mom and pop stores. But there has to be accountability here. I'm sorry, there has to be regulation and accountability in this sector of our lives because it is so crucial to how everything else functions. It is literally the lifeblood of our society. The difficulty is, in order to do the reporting that we need to get past the shell companies, it requires all of our legitimate, honest businesses to disclose lots of information and do significant reporting, said Crapo, the Senate Banking Community Chair. Well, why is that a big deal? If these banks aren't doing anything illegal or untowards, then they should have no problem reporting all of this stuff. I know I had no problem filling out SARS when I was in a position that called for it. That's my job. Like Bill Belichick says, do your job. The National Federation of Independent Business, the largest and most influential small business group in the country, is leading the charge to block the legislation. We just don't believe it's worth criminalizing a new paperwork burden. It's a scary thing for small business owners who don't have the time, resources, or bandwidth, said Kevin Kuhlman, the group's vice president of federal government relations. That doesn't sit well with me. You don't have the time or the resources to make sure that there's no money laundering occurring, to make sure that the lifeblood of Western civilization is flowing with good, clean money. I think that's something we should all be concerned about and something we should all be putting resources towards to stop. Kuhlman argues the legislation would inflict small businesses with burdensome reporting obligations under threat of fines or jail time. The House legislation authored by Representative Carolyn Maloney outlines fines of up to $10,000 and up to 3 years in prison for owners of companies that provide false information or refuse to comply. Kuhlman also raised the possibility of hackers accessing the FinCEN data. Oh yeah, of course, that's it, right? Oh, hackers. Let me guess, Goosifer 2.0 is going to show up and hack this too. Give me an absolute break with the hacker nonsense. I am so tired of that bullshit, okay? It's going to get hacked. Well, employ better defensive specialists when it comes to your internet and your protection of people's information. How about that? Invest a little bit more money. For most legislation in Washington, it's obvious in advance whether it will pass or not. But this is a rare case where the legislation is close to the finish line and no one knows what will happen. Usually we have an idea, right? Usually there's some leaks. We hear from one side or the other. People are talking about the bills and we understand one way or the other what's going to occur. That is something that, policy wonks like myself are used to seeing. But I really haven't heard much about this bill. This is not a bill that has really been talked about. Obviously, coronavirus and the election and all of that jazz is eating up the news cycle. But this is a bill that you think would be talked about a little bit, no? To get a bill like this through Congress, you typically need support from the four corners. The top Republican and Democrat on both the Senate Banking Committee and the House Financial Services Committee. The bill has support from only three. Political aides and outside stakeholders say Representative Patrick McHenry, the ranking Republican on the House side, is the main force of opposition. With him opposed, passage of the bill is in jeopardy. I think it is probably 50-50, Kuhlman said, of the bill's chances. All right, so Representative Patrick McHenry, I highly doubt you're listening to this podcast, but if you are, come on, man, get your shit together, bro. This isn't a partisan issue. This isn't the time to dig in, all right? Let's get some accountability for these banksters, dude. Let's get these guys in line. You talk about how you're a conservative and how you want to save money and this, that, the other thing, but yet you're letting these banks literally steal not only from your constituents, but from others. And you're going to be the impediment holding this bill up? Unacceptable, sir. Unacceptable. And you should be challenged on the floor to defend your position, like the old days. If I was in Congress, forget it. You folks would be tuning into C-SPAN on a regular basis because I would be letting all of these idiots have it. What an absolute clown show. The conclusion will not come down to a dramatic vote on the floor of Congress. Rather, it likely will be worked out in closed-door negotiations. Proponents want to include the legislation in the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, a must-pass bill that funds the military. The Democrat-controlled House included it in its version of the NDAA. Nope, I don't like that. I don't want to pork in. Let's make the bills for what they are, okay? Let's make this a standalone bill and let it stand on its own merits and let these politicians hang themselves with their shit votes. And then, like I talked about earlier, vote them out. Hold them accountable. There's people listening to this podcast from all over the country. If all of us voted out these incumbents and actually sent our neighbors to D.C. to do the people's work, do you really think we'd be worse off? I know there's people out there, oh, we need lawyers and we need... No, we don't. No, we don't. Okay? Where has that gotten us? It's time to try something new. Crapo and Brown proposed their legislation, which is almost identical to the House version, as an amendment to the Senate's NDAA, but it was not adopted. Crapo said he believes there is enough bipartisan support in the Senate to pass the legislation. The problem, he said, was that so many senators were proposing controversial add-ons to the NDAA that Senate leadership ended up cutting almost all of them out, including the money laundering provision, so as not to sink the overall bill. That's why stuffing pork into these bills makes me crazy. I don't want to go off on a policy wonk tangent here because that's not what you folks are listening for. But this is right in my wheelhouse, this kind of thing. This is what I went to school for, political science. And it just makes me mental when they shove pork in these bills and they don't let them stand on their own merit. It is a big problem in D.C., folks, and it's both sides. Enough with your pet projects. Can we do the work of the people for once, please? It was not wanting to kill the overall NDAA by having it amended to death, said Crapo. There's a dozen controversial amendments, and if you let one amendment go, then the floodgates open. But with the House including money laundering provisions in its version, Crapo said that gives congressional negotiators an opening to include some version in the final bill that will have to pass both chambers. The House and Senate, they have already begun those negotiations. The next several weeks will be critical with their dueling industries lobbying for their interests. Again, lobbyists, FK Street too. If I had my druthers, there would be no more lobbyists. Send them all home. And as far as our senators and congresspeople, it's obvious that they can do their job remotely, so how about they go back to their districts and start doing the work of the people as opposed to the work of the people that give them money. Banks are lobbying for Crapo's legislation because they say they need help thwarting money laundering. They are required to report clients' questionable transactions by filing suspicious activity reports, or SARs, to FinCEN. And the industry sees this as an onerous and expensive burden. Oh yeah, real expensive. I'll tell you what, why don't you just use some of the money that you've taken from me when I was younger with those predatory loans you like to slap on people without a credit score, or people who might have bad credit? Why don't you take the money from there, you bunch of effing crooks? The Banking Policy Institute, whose members include both domestic banks and large foreign banks doing business in the U.S., said these financial institutions employ 14,000 people dedicated to compliance, and it only takes a couple of those people in compliance to be on the losing team, right? To be cheating. A BPI survey from 2017 found member banks reviewed 16 million alerts and filed 640,000 SARs. But they reported that only 4% of SARs received follow-up inquiries from law enforcement. Banks also filed 5.2 million currency transaction reports, which law enforcement followed up less than half of 1% of the time, according to BPI. In other words, folks, in language we can explain, They let these people do whatever they want, no oversight, and the SARs are a joke. Pretty much what they're saying. Forcing companies to disclose their true beneficial ownership was first proposed in Congress back in 2008. It's gone through different versions since then. Earlier proposals would have forced companies to disclose their own ownership publicly, but both the House and Senate versions of the bill would only require disclosure to FinCEN. Well, that's interesting that it came up back in 2008. After Obama won, he had the House and the Senate plus the presidency. I really wonder why they didn't shove it through then. They had the power to do so. Could it be that some of the senators and Congress people were benefiting from it, so they didn't bother? I wonder. The politically powerful Koch family previously opposed the legislation and had lobbied Congress to make changes. Shocking, the Koch family. A bunch of scumbags who have money to burn and they inject themselves into politics on a regular basis. The right's version of George Soros, basically. In response, the Senate version was massaged to expand exemptions for nonprofit organizations again, right? Which are used as part of the Koch's political operations. The Kochs have now dropped their objections to the legislation, according to congressional aides with knowledge of the talks. I wonder how they were massaged into doing that. What sort of backroom deals did they make with these Congress people? This type of bipartisan cooperation doesn't come around every day, said BPI head of government affairs, Mike Lee, and represents years of stakeholders' negotiations and scrutiny. Well, look, again, it doesn't go far enough, it's not strong enough, but at least it's something. It's a starting point. It gives us a place to start and to point and say to politicians who want our vote, look, this is important to us. This money laundering issue is important to us. The fact that Jeffrey Epstein was able to run a sex trafficking ring where he trafficked children using this system and this money is important to us. And you must fix it. That is why we're sending you to D.C. Fix this. Protect our children. Very basic shit here. And yet they have failed for decades. So folks, I ask you, what are you going to do when it's election day? Are you going to vote for the same old shit, the same old garbage? Or are you going to make a change? And I'm not talking about making a change from R to D or D to R. I'm talking about voting for a people who actually care. And the only way that's ever going to happen is if we force the issue. No more career politicians. No more political class. If you're going to Washington, D.C., you should be going there to do the people's work, not enrich yourself, and certainly not to protect people like Jeffrey Epstein. If you'd like to contact me, you can do that at bobbycapucci@protonmail.com. That's BOBBYCAPUCCI @protonmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter at BOBBY_CAPUCCI. We also have a Facebook page for the podcast. If you want to join the conversation, the link will be in the description box, along with the rest of the links that go along with the episode. All right, everybody, I will be back later on, and we will pick the conversation up then. Everybody, enjoy your Tuesday.
At Ease, we're all about calculating the best high for you. Ran out of shows to watch for the second time this week? Order an Indica pre-roll. Social distance park hang, pair that awkward picnic with a vaporizer. See, we're like your weed guy, but 420% nerdier. So just worry about when you're going to take that edible and let us do the rest. Ease, highly calculated cannabis delivery. Get 30% off your first order with promo code NERD at ease.com. That's EAZE.com.
Rogue Nicotine on demand. Delivered direct to your door. Available in all your favorite flavors and formats. Pouches, gum, wintergreen, peppermint, and more. From your Monday morning coffee to watching hoops to dinner at the in-laws, Rogue Nicotine is there for you when you need it. Visit RogueNicotine.com today and save 10% when you place your order for sugar-free, fast-acting Rogue Nicotine. Underage sales prohibited. This product contains nicotine. Nicotine is an addictive chemical. For more information, visit RogueNicotine.com.